Hello, everyone. Welcome to Go For It podcast number 11. I'm here with Chikodi Chima. Hello, welcome to the podcast, Chikodi.
Josh, thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. So just to introduce Chikodi to everyone listening, Chikodi Chima is a former staff reporter at Venturebeat and a public relations veteran specializing in the technology startup ecosystem. He specializes in reputation management, press releases, corporate communications, media strategy, and executive thought leadership. Chikodi's clients have appeared in TechCrunch, Fast Company, Business Insider, Bloomberg Businessweek, Venturebeat, The Washington Post, and many more. So that was quite a collection of very well vaunted, I think that's the right word, vaunted publications. His clients have collectively raised over $1 billion. Clearly, proper public relations is a part of that story of raising $1 billion. His company website has a really interesting tagline that I really want to get into in this podcast, which is public relations is about getting your phone to ring. It's a very simple statement, but I think it's a very powerful one. And yeah, Chikodi, why don't you tell us about public relations? At least I know in my career, I've very rarely needed to engage, not needed to, but I've just never engaged with a PR person or public relations veteran. So tell us like what it is just from the top.
All right. Well, every business is a story. At the end of the day, there's a problem and there's a solution, and that business is the journey from problem to solution. The people that make up the business, the landscape in the business environment, all of that is kind of the tension around the story, but a business is a story. And so being able to tell the story well and articulate it to the people who are in need is a critical function of a CEO. And then as the team grows, there are other people that take on those responsibilities. But if you don't have a story, you're not going to connect with the people who need you. And so at the end of the day, my livelihood, my life is about helping businesses tell those stories.
That's awesome. So what separates the public relations field from the marketing field, or is there overlap?
I would say that the umbrella under which public relations exists is marketing. It's about awareness. It's about driving a behavior. It's about conversion and influence. And so all of that is a marketing function. I used to kind of go back and forth and say, well, public relations is separate from marketing. It's really not, because it's about the message that the story has to tell. And so that's the taglines, copywriting, content, all of those things. And, done well, it's like a flywheel, or it's a gear that they spin each other and they accelerate one another. So public relations is definitely a specialized marketing function.
Awesome. Okay, so I was reading your introduction. You've clearly got a lot of traction in really well-known publications. Can you tell us how you got started? Because the name of this podcast is the Go For It podcast. So I'm really trying to encourage people to engage with people who are doing interesting things. I think that what you do is really interesting, but I don't know much about it. So how did you get started in the public relations field?
Yeah, so I went to journalism school at Columbia, got my master's, and then actually moved to India. And I spent a year in India, and we brought the TED conference to India, and we did TED India, and I was doing digital marketing there. And I was freelancing for publications in the US. And I was certain that I was going to move to New York and, kind of reconnect with that chapter of my life, because I'd been in New York for the 5 years previous. A colleague of mine who graduated the year after me posted something about a publisher starting a new publication, and they were looking to talk to people. And even though I was in India, I applied, went through several rounds of interviews. I remember actually doing an interview on Skype in a hostel on the beach on the island of Langkawi in Malaysia. And it went well, and I got the job, and I thought I was going to move to New York. And, like I said, they ended up wanting someone to stay on the West Coast. So they gave me the job contingent on me staying on the West Coast. And it was a publication about sustainable transportation. So during that time, on my birthday, actually, was the BP oil spill disaster. The publication launched when Tesla IPO'd. We broke ground in California on the high-speed rail. The Nissan Leaf, which is an all-electric vehicle, hit the road for the first time. So there's a lot of really pivotal things happening in sustainable transportation right when this publication launched. So I became an instant expert in all things sustainable transportation. I had always been interested in sustainability, but I had to learn really quickly in order to build this audience and build my platform. So that happened. We grew the publication about 80,000 monthly uniques, but then it folded. So from there, I did some startup consulting.
Wait, that's not, like, the publication sounded like it was in a really good spot. How did it just fold? Like, you can't just skip over.
Yeah, okay. So, it's one thing in business to do a good thing, but you have to do a good thing for the right people. And the economics of publishing is that you need a lot of page views. Most publications, they make their money off of conferences, sponsored content, other things. So, it's not easy to keep a publication going purely on the basis of content. So we somewhat had a benevolent organization that thought they could launch this and scale up the ads, which is how our salaries and health insurance and everything was paid for. So I don't think they had the success they thought. And right soon after I came in, the managing editor and the executive editor who oversaw the managing editor who was my boss, they both got fired. So it was maybe a month after, got fired, left, whatever you want to call it. But it was about a month after they left, maybe 2 months, that I left the publication, and it folded shortly thereafter. It was a really pivotal experience. I mean, I learned how to build online communities around content and around, just people deeply care about bicycling, for instance.
Right.
Maybe not a surprise, but people really, 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 really care about bicycling. I was an avid cyclist, in New York, and when I first moved to San Francisco. And so, finding out what are the communities that really care about bicycles online, and, pumping content into our site and cross-promoting it really helped us grow traffic. And it's the same, in public relations. It's like, you need to care about what your audience cares about. So everything that I've done in the last 10 years really was an outgrowth of this experience of launching this publication. And we can certainly talk about that. But basically, I learned how to become a subject matter expert almost overnight in sustainable transportation. And as a business owner, you need to go through the same steps in order to, rise above the crowd in your industry.
That's awesome.
So I ended up going to work for the Next Web and Venturebeat. And after writing for both of those publications and doing some freelance contribution to Fast Company, Mashable, et cetera, I founded Moonshot.
So that's your current company now that you've been there. It's your company, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and you've been doing essentially public relations consulting for the past 10 years?
Yeah, what I'm doing now, I've done in some form or fashion for about 10 years. I left Alt Transport, which is the name of the publication, pretty much the week before Thanksgiving in 2010. So it's been about 10 years exactly when we're recording this.
Awesome. Well, okay, I have so many questions for you, Chikodi, but I would love to know how you ended up in India before you started working for the sustainable transportation focused publication. Like, tell us about India. Like, that's going to be interesting to the vast majority of the audience.
Sure. India is amazing. It's like everything you've heard about it is true, and you haven't heard anything at all. It's just it's a giant country. Comparing it to American states, I think it's like as big as Texas and Alaska, at least. 1.2 billion people, 600 million people under the age of 20. So it's just a giant, amazing country. And, when I enrolled in journalism school, was the very beginning of the housing crash in 2008. So the whole economy went off a cliff. And as you can imagine, it clearly affected the journalism profession. So I had colleagues who were lucky enough to get jobs, and they were getting jobs in journalism for $27,000 to $32,000 a year after going to a private grad school.
Yeah.
I interviewed with one major publication, and there wasn't really anything particularly compelling for me to do in the US. And a family friend who is a TEDster said, well, why don't you come to India and help me?
A TEDster, like a TED Talk person? What does that mean?
Yeah. She's a TED attendee and had been going for a number of years, was very much in the inner circle of TED.
Okay.
So she didn't explain what I was going to do. She didn't explain what she was really doing. She just said, why don't you come to India and help me? And my mentor, Sri Srinivasan, I was like, well, what if I stayed here and I worked at this publication that I was interviewing at? And he said, you can always come back to New York and get a job. And, but you can't always go to India. I mean, he's a little, actually, even though he's Indian, he was born in Tokyo because his dad is a diplomat. That's a fascinating story.
That's so interesting.
But,
wow.
But he's biased, so he's biased because he's Indian. So he said, go to India. And I did, and it was just amazing. I was there working, a lot of times people ask like, oh, were you like backpacking? Were you in an ashram? No, I was living in a, condo complex. We had a swimming pool and there was a,
where were you?
In Bangalore.
Bangalore, okay.
Mm-hmm. So literally outside the wall of the compound was Mercedes-Benz, like the technical back end, America Online. I think the Amazon Kindle was actually developed literally like outside the wall where we lived. And it was right underneath the runway to the old airport. So very modern and both modern and ancient. You had temples all over the place. You would have cows just wandering the street. You'd have monkeys running around. It was just, and then you'd have like these big lorries like zooming past all of the dogs and monkeys and kids and everything. So it was all just like so much life crammed into every square inch, and the color and the sound and people are amazing, and the food and the festivals and, so, to kind of encapsulate it, when I left the United States, our economy was crumbling. People were losing their jobs by the hundreds of thousands, although it doesn't compare to COVID. It was quite traumatic at the time. But in India, the economy was booming. The economy was growing at a really healthy percentage. People were being lifted out of poverty by the tens of millions. Internet was going across the country. So new business opportunities, new possibilities for tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. And it was just a really, really exciting time to be there. Like with mobile phones, there was ideas about like telehealth. So being able to talk to a doctor through the phone.
Wow.
Or remote education. So a lot of the things that in the pandemic are becoming part of mainstream American life, I got to experience that 10, 11 years ago in India, because here's people that live in rural, remote areas, no access to the internet before, no access to electricity, no running water, but you give them a cell phone and a solar cell phone charger, all of a sudden their kids can be educated. All of a sudden they can see a doctor when they need to. So these are things that in the US, we are turning to out of in a crisis situation, but these were opportunities that I got to see firsthand living in India.
That's excellent. So I want to go back forward in time now, because you said something that was incredibly interesting that I think would provide a lot of value to the listeners of this podcast. You said when you were working for the Sustainable Transportation publication, you said you learned how to become a subject matter expert. And the way you said that was as if like you did it again, because you're clearly not working in that field now. And now you're a technology startup ecosystem focused PR veteran. Like, tell us what that means. How do you become a subject matter expert? You became one and you clearly replicated it.
Well, I'm not working in the field.
Oh, okay, excuse me. Okay.
Yeah. When you really boil it down, everything is connected to everything else. You just have to look for the connection, you
Mhm.
know? So how I became an instant subject matter expert, and how you, if you're interested in becoming an subject matter expert, is that, I have a technique that I call breadcrumbs, and I've given a lot of talks about it. But if you're familiar with the story of Hansel and Gretel, um, they were being led into the woods, and their evil stepmother expected them not to be able to find their way back to the cabin. But Hansel took a piece of bread and he dropped the bread along the path, and they were able to find their cabin in the woods by following the bread. So a similar thing happens in the world in which we live, in which we're just inundated with information, but only some of the information is relevant to you. So when it came to sustainable transportation, there were certain important words that meant very specific things. So the beginning of ride sharing, like being able to rent your car on a platform like Getaround, there was an assembly bill in the state of California that first made that possible, that made the insurance policies able to uh, cover people's cars in that kind of a ride sharing arrangement. I think it was AB 57. Don't quote me on that. But suffice it to say, there was an assembly bill. So anytime I could look up on Google, and let's just, for the sake of argument, let's say it was AB 57. You just use Google and you search for AB 57, and in the Google News search, you see the sponsor of the legislation, you see what committee it's going through, any discussion, and then you realize that if there's a journalist writing about AB 57, and you're a transportation company and you're in the shared transportation space, that journalist is someone you should be talking to, because they're covering your industry. So all of the noise that exists out there on the internet, if you are looking for AB 57, then you're going to talk to somebody who's interested in that kind of transportation arrangement. Another word was jatropha, Jatropha, and it was a seed, and you could grow it quickly, and then you squeeze oil out of the seed, and that was a replacement biofuel. So it's not a popular replacement biofuel, but at the time that I was doing this publication, people were talking about jatropha as a replacement for petroleum. So if I saw a blog about it, or if I saw like a news article, then I knew this is a publication that's relevant. So what I tell people is that those are the breadcrumbs that you use to find your audience. And you can do that 30 minutes, 15 minutes, even if you're in a rush. And those are the conversations you want to get into. You want to know who's having those conversations, what's the commentary in articles, are people tweeting about it, what have you. So if you're in software, you want to be as specific as possible. When a technology is new, like in 2012, probably, if Snapchat was even a thing in 2012, there were probably only a handful of articles written about Snapchat. So you could identify every journalist who'd ever written about Snapchat in its early days, because it's a proper noun. Same thing with the CEO, Evan Spiegel. There's only so many Evan Spiegels, and an article that has the word Snapchat and Evan Spiegel, you could identify all those reporters. When it comes to your industry, like Kubernetes is now too big of a technology, but it's a very specific word. It's not used for anything except computing and storage and big data, So anytime you see that appear, you know that it's a publication about computing. But you want to be as specific as possible. So I'm kind of like grappling for a word here. I keep thinking of like bigger concepts like autonomous vehicles. So anyway, the reason why I say to use legislation is because all industries are regulated by somebody. And if there's a new piece of legislation, then it's time sensitive, and it allows you to see the landscape around an industry, and there's a certain urgency about it. So the reporters that are reporting about a piece of legislation that affects your industry, if you have something to say to them about how you are going to shape the future of that industry, then that piece of legislation being discussed in the press is a way to establish yourself as an expert. Does that make sense?
It does, but you're telling us from the perspective of getting to know people. Like, so we're kind of segueing into something else that's really interesting. As I've spoken to you before, like that whole networking aspect. Like, the way I'm interpreting what you're saying about the breadcrumbs is that they give you clues into who you need to be talking to, the subjects you need to become familiar with, to learn a new like business vertical effectively, right?
If I need to parachute into an industry, I have my skill set, but then in order to get familiar with a new industry, I can use breadcrumbs and be quite knowledgeable very quickly, you know, not an expert, you know, like you as the business owner, you as the CEO need to be the ultimate expert, and I can help prop you up as the expert and point you in the right direction. But in order for me to understand what that direction is, I just go on Twitter, you know, and I can see the names of the other CEOs in the same industry, the names of the companies, if there's a specific product that people use or specific product that is prominent, you know, and that gives me kind of an understanding of the landscape, and that can be done very, very quickly using breadcrumbs.
Awesome. Okay, that makes sense. So we're kind of transitioning into, because you spoke about reporters in different industries and getting in touch with said reporters, and you mentioned on your website that you've helped companies collectively raise over $1 billion, which is an impressive amount of money. And that kind of money, you pretty much need to know somebody. So like you started transitioning to talking about relationships. I'd love to hear about if somebody wanted to be a public relations professional. It sounds like that networking aspect, that building of relationships, maintaining relationships is an important aspect of it. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So, you know, again, it's in your story. I'll just bring it back to that, is that your story has to be relevant to the people that are listening, you know? So when you are talking to investors, you have a story that they want to hear. And it's not all that different from the story that a journalist is going to want to hear. The more compelling, the more urgent, the more exciting your story is to a journalist, the more likely they are to write about you. And the same thing goes. If you are more compelling, have more of a sense of urgency and a sense of predestiny, then you're more likely to get funded by an investor. So, you know, it's almost one and the same. And, you know, if you have a media footprint, you're more likely to get press. If you have press, you're more likely to get, you know, if you have a media footprint, you're more likely to get funded. And if you're funded, you're more likely to get media. But you have to have a good story in any event. So you can have actually a mediocre company or a mediocre team, but if you have a good story, you're going to be more successful than the great team that doesn't know how to talk about itself.
That's powerful. Okay. So if somebody was wanting to become a public relations professional, say like you go all the way back to the beginning, it seems like there's a lot of, it just sounds like a profession that requires a lot of skill in regards to learning new business verticals, making relationships with people, crafting that story. Like it just sounds like it sounds very much like a meritocracy industry. Like how can people succeed in that, in your craft?
Well, you know, I didn't used to have any gray hairs before I got into this. But you know, my dad has gray hair, so I think it was going to happen regardless. But yeah, you know, the thing about public relations is there's the storytelling aspect of it, but then you have to be very detail oriented. You have to be able to keep personal details in mind. So you need to know what reporter, what publication covers a certain thing a certain way, and how to approach them. you know, and you have to do that across a lot of publications. So it can be really very beneficial to go deep instead of wide, so that you know all of the publications about autonomous vehicles, for instance, and all the reporters, or micro mobility. You know, there's far fewer publications about micro mobility, but then when you have those close relationships that you form over time, you know, it's like in the pre-COVID world, you would go to parties and journalists would be there, and you'd either buy them a drink or you'd have a drink with them and just get them talking. And, you know, everybody likes to talk about themselves. So, you know, the best thing you can do as a aspiring publicist is find out what people like to talk about themselves and be interested in that. But yeah, doing a lot of networking so that when you have a client who has a story, then you can be the go-to person to say, oh, hey, I had a good conversation with this person, or we went to ramen after drinks, and you know, I'm going to hit this person up on behalf of the client. So, you know, the rudimentary skills you need to be a very solid writer. You need to be a good editor. You need to be able to craft a narrative, and then work in a team context. I actually work by myself, and I haven't really done that much agency work, and I came from a journalism perspective. So a lot of people just, you know, come up from junior.
My apologies. I couldn't hear what you said.
Sorry. So a lot of times people come right out of school and they get right into PR, and then they just advance. I came from, you know, the side door, if you will, as a reporter and storyteller. But I think a lot of people either study PR or they study marketing or communications or something in the writing field, and then get into public relations. So that's kind of how you get in as a student, is that you're kind of on the track from school. Doesn't mean that you have to, but you know, you're probably going to like it more if you like writing already.
So how do you know you've arrived in the public relations career? Because it sounds like what gets me excited about it as you describe it, it just sounds like something that has no ceiling. It sounds like if you're doing really well in the PR field, you could be making millions of dollars a year, but if you suck, you could be making pennies too. Like that sounds very appealing to me as somebody who like believes in meritocracy. Like, how do you know you're good?
Yeah, well, you know you're good when you get to pick who you work with and who you say no to. And, you know, you're good when people want to work with you so much that they're offering you equity in their company. Wow. So, you know, you can reasonably expect to have some exits and participate in some exits with companies if you find them at the right stage. If you don't want to work with early stage, you may have fewer gray hairs. But if you're able to get on a ride with an early stage company and they say, hey, you know, we really appreciate you. Here's a small grant of some shares. Or if you trade some of your cash value for shares, then that's how you can actually be there on IPO day as a winner, or on acquisition day. That actually happened for me for a company, not an IPO, but you know, I was able to participate as a shareholder in a company that is quite large right now. It's possible, you know, and I'm definitely myself interested in working with more early stage companies that are, you know, that operate that way. And, you know, one of the things that's cool is that they're doing risky new things. And so telling their story is more interesting because you have to get people to believe in something that doesn't exist yet. Right. It's very challenging and it puts all your skills to work. So there's you know, multiple incentives there. One, it keeps me on my toes, keeps me and you know, in peak performance. And then also, it's not going to happen all of the time, but you know, when you're the entrepreneur, you only get to work on one company at a time. And in a position like mine, if I'm taking equity in, you know, small equity positions in a few different companies that I'm helping, then I can place multiple bets, you know. So that is, not everybody even likes to work that way. because it doesn't always work out. But, for people willing to take the risk, you get to take the ride. And I have a colleague in New York, and he, worked with I want to say it was an e-commerce brand, but they got acquired, and he was able to buy a building in Soho, where his office is, as a young guy in his 30s.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So how would you I was saying earlier, I've not done a lot of work with publicists in the past. How do you know your company is in need of a publicist? I think most companies would be like, at least for me, I'd be like, oh, I need a marketing person. How do people know that they need you?
You always need me.
I'm glad to believe myself.
You go to a barber, and a barber is always going to say you need a haircut. At least I know that I do. But I just think that storytelling is so important at every stage of your company, every day, that you should be engaged in the PR process at all times. Whether you're engaging a PR agency or not is a different matter. But you should take PR into your own hands and take it very seriously. As an early stage company, as an early stage founder, I get how many hats you have to wear, how challenging it is to keep all these plates spinning. But telling your story is really vital, because you're either selling to investors that this is why you should give us money. You're selling to customers that you should give us money. And those are the best investors, is that this is why our product is necessary. This is going to help you save money, help you save time, make your life easier. You're selling to potential recruits. And the best way to sell is to have PR out there in the world and have stories about you that people can find when you, Josh, are not there on the spot selling to these people. So having that out there, having a story that attracts and attracts people that are aligned with the story and the mission is a really important value of PR. And done well, not easy to do, but done well, PR is an extremely scalable, cost-effective way to market.
Right, that's awesome.
Get your
so
story.
I'm sorry.
But it's really the skill and the discipline. I was just saying that it's not easy to do, but once you have the wheel turn, and so that's the other thing, is that you don't want to just do PR and then 6 months later be like, oh, we should do something, shouldn't we? Because you want to keep you want to keep beating the drum, and you don't want to be only in need of some kind of PR attention at the moment you need it. You want to make sure that you have a process in place and momentum well before you need it.
That's awesome. So there's this woman that I've heard of. This is a friend of mine's friend, and they call her a spin doctor. Have you ever heard of that phrase in the PR craft? Can you tell us what that is? And just give us some insight into what a spin doctor does, because I think it's very related to your craft.
Yes. That is another name for a publicist. And I used to not like it, but I actually take pride in it now. So spin doctor is somebody who can take something that's not related and make it related and make you care about it for your client, or harmful, and turn it pivoting. So spin doctor, there's another term that's kind of like an industry term, and that's newsjacking. And that's where you take a story that's about this over here, and say, oh, hey, we're relevant. This is about us as well. So the other term is, let's just call it newsjacking, So you're basically hijacking a topic. And that's what a spin doctor does, is they're like, hey, well, let's say everything is about COVID, So how do you make something, like if you're a food delivery app or you're like a route planning software or something like that, then you need to be relevant. So basically, there's two things being a spin doctor. Either you make something relevant that doesn't seem related, or you make it irrelevant so that people focus their attention on something else.
That's so cool.
So that's where the reputation management comes in. Is you're like, hey, look over there.
Yep.
And a really skillful publicist just like change the story so it's not about your clients anymore if it's bad. Or you take it and you're like, hey, we did a bad thing and people were, we disappointed people's expectations. We're sorry, and here's how we're going to do better. So you own, like, if something happens, if a company down to expectations, then you'd hire a crisis communication specialist, and they would spin it so that the story. Yeah, I think I cut out. So I was saying that if a company has disappointed the expectations of their stakeholders and customers, then a spin doctor, a crisis communication specialist, will take the story, hopefully take accountability, and then say, we're going to do better. Let's move on, and the next burning building, the next cat stuck in a tree is going to happen. But if you don't handle a crisis well, then it's like the cover up is worse than the crime, they've said. So it's really about like how to take your lumps and then let people they said, we don't want to allow any kind of political activity on our, amongst our employees. And then there was this New York Times story about, implicit bias and, just overt bias, anti-Blackness in Coinbase. And they said, we did our own investigation. We found we didn't do anything wrong. And, that just doesn't, if they had a publicist that the CEO listened to, then they could say a lot of different things if they cared, So it's not entirely clear that they actually care about what people feel about what they did and what the New York Times wrote about. So a spin doctor, working with a leadership team, working with an organization, can position an organization to respond to something that's not good and say, we're learning, we care, here we commit to doing in the future, we apologize, all of those things. But you have to be able to respond really quickly. And you also have to mean it. If you don't mean it, then all the good words in the world doesn't really change anything. But that's does that make sense? How a spin doctor takes something and spins it,
Right. Yeah, it very much does.
Okay.
What I like about it is that it sounds like it's very high stakes. And that's what it sounds like. What's interesting to me about your craft is it sounds like there are just so many levels to it. And that actually leads into my next question, which is how do you tell between, because it's so skill-based, your profession, how do you tell between a good publicist and a bad publicist?
Who do you like working with?
Okay.
Because the skills, the skill is not what I do, it's how I do it. It's how I work with the clients. Some clients are really difficult, they have unreasonable expectations. They have champagne dreams and Kool-Aid budgets, or they just don't know how to tell a good story about themselves to get me excited, or they want to tell it in a certain way, and the market is something else. So my ability to work with a client, either because they are challenging or because their story is extremely challenging, and to be able to get my mind around it, that's the actual skill of PR. The tactic of just like, okay, we're going to pitch this and we're going to follow up and, this, that, the other thing. That's really the easy part, but it's like managing the clients, managing expectations, dealing with the unexpected. Those are all of the veteran skills that actually make a good publicist. Everyone can write a press release. If you can't write a press release today, you can certainly Google press release template and copy it, but managing clients, managing things behind the scenes, there's a million there's a million things that are underground things that you have to do to make sure that everything on the surface appears smooth. And that's like, not everybody can do that. It can be extremely stressful. There's late nights, early mornings, a lot of communication. So, a good publicist is doing that and going to bat for you. And you don't have to know everything, that's, throughout my career, it's like I've struggled a lot of times with like people that don't want to know everything that's going on in the company. And I understand the need for that, but it's like, there's so much that goes into a successful PR campaign that you don't even want to know about. There's horse trading. There's just like, you owe me a favor from way back, like all of that can come into play. So you don't necessarily need to know that. You're not going to add value by knowing that necessarily. I'm not saying that 100% of times, but that's what a veteran publicist does, is like having built up these relationships and just an understanding over a decade or decades. There's people that I look up to that have been doing this for 30 or 40 years. So just knowing that someone is going to bat for you, someone is going to back you up and do everything they can to make your story pop, that's a good publicist. It's not just getting you in the news. It's getting you prepared for an interview, getting you excited about you. All of those things are what define a good publicist. And then, like Olivia Pope in Scandal, it's like, she just like gets stuff done, she knows how to get stuff done. So that's exactly what a publicist does, is like, I know who to call. I know what button to push. I know what lever to pull when. Don't ask me how, don't ask me too many questions, but I'll get it done for you. And so a good publicist, you're like, they're just, things just happen.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is so, I think this is so interesting to me. Your craft is so interesting to me because I find that it's a lot different than mine working in software, because mine it's very binary. Either the thing works or it doesn't. But yours, it's like, there's so much on the creative side. There's so much creative expression. And like you said, like there's a political aspect. There's a written aspect. There's can I prepare you for this interview aspect. There's the preparing the client. Like, it's almost like it's like everything. Like, you want to be a publicist? Give me everything. Like in what's that movie? Avengers, like when he had to sacrifice his daughter to become, I don't even know become a god. Like, it seems like it takes everything to be a publicist.
And it's not for everybody, it's like you do it for a season. But it's just, it's like a full court press all the time. And you just got to leave it on the court at the end of the game, basically, at the end of the day. And that's not always so easy to do, because you're like thinking, at least I'm thinking like, oh, what if I try to make the client fit into this story, or, news breaks, like, that's what's so challenging too, is like news can break. Facebook could get hauled in front of Congress again, and it totally affects this. Or, I saw this thing actually today is, December 15th. And there was an announcement that Facebook is doing a new service where you can pay an influencer to be in their videos, or, take a selfie with you. I forget what the thing is called, but there's actually somebody that I'm working with right now, and they're working on something similar. They want to quit their jobs and make this a full-time startup, and Facebook basically just killed their business, okay, sorry, like can't mess with Facebook. They're early enough that they could pivot and do something with this thing, but it's like, they always run the risk, especially in software, that Facebook or Google or Microsoft or Amazon is going to kill your business overnight, and you can never predict it. And so as a publicist, I have to be ready to help them either respond or, shift a publication deadline or something like that, in order to capitalize. So, that's where again, challenges arise, and that's where you can have a lot of sleepless nights and things like that. But it just keeps you on your toes,
Right. Okay. So tell us about the transition from working as a reporter. Like you said, you kind of came in through the side door into the public relations craft. How did that transition go from both going from a reporter to a publicist, but also going into business for yourself?
There was no plan per se. I do remember trying to come up with a name for the company, and it was just like I was riding the bus, and it was like a flash, It was like, well, what? Yeah, I could have named my company anything. A lot of people name their company after themselves, so but I just wanted to be very much of the culture of startups and technology. Moonshots are really big, audacious bets. So, the real process was that I was at a crossroads. I was like, hey, I told a friend of mine the kind of predicament that I was in, and he told me to do something that he had done, which was that he had an event series in New York. And it was actually before TED got popular. He was basically doing TED Talks in people's living rooms and in cool spaces in New York. And it was exactly what TED was doing also. So he had this list of influential people, in New York. And at a time when he was about to have a baby, and he wasn't really like doing what he wanted to do career-wise and money-wise, he sent out an email to about 200 people, and he was bombarded with opportunities. He just laid it all on the table. He said, this is what I'm up against, and these are my skills. Here's how you can help me. And within a day, I think he had a job that he kept for 5 years. So a similar thing happened with me, where I had left journalism. I was doing some different things to just survive in San Francisco,
right.
And I was like, hey, if this doesn't work out in a couple of days, I might give up my apartment and move out of San Francisco, go back to Seattle where I'm from, or go to New York, or I don't know, but I'm like, this is it. And so I did the same thing. I wrote 200 or so people, and a bunch of different opportunities were presented to me. Some were like, oh, you could be like a salesperson, or you could do this. And I actually did a couple, but one of my classmates, who I played rugby with at Columbia, he reached out and said, I have this app, and it takes Twitter feeds, and during NBA basketball games, it takes the Twitter feeds of the top NBA reporters, and it uses AI to analyze what's going on. And so you get a live streaming telecast of a basketball game using AI and natural language processing. Mm-hmm. Can you help me get my startup featured in tech publications? So I responded to that, and I got him featured in TechCrunch, and at the same time, someone else recommended me to a company that is a YouTube analytics platform. And this is right when Gangnam Style became the first video to reach 1 billion views. So there's a certain amount of being in the right place at the right time. But again, using this breadcrumbs technique, I was able to get so much press for this company. I worked so hard, and it was super satisfying, but I was getting paid $20 an hour, But at that point, when I was done with those two, I was a publicist, and I was like, I did this, I can do it again, and that was like 8+ years ago. So that's how I didn't, like when I say I came in through the side door, like I didn't know I was going to be a publicist. I didn't know I was going to like it. Right. I didn't know I was going to stay doing it, but here I am, So I learned everything. I taught myself everything, and I've had mentors, and I've benefited from, guidance along the way, but I didn't like go to an agency, develop client relationships, take those clients out, and then start my agency off of clients that I poached from the agency I was working at. I bootstrapped this all. And so that's why I get fired up just because it's like I had to teach all of the stuff to myself, and burnt my fingers a lot. But you know, I'm glad that I did it.
What advice would you have for somebody trying to, because the name of this podcast, the Go For It podcast, I'm really interested in inspiring people and allowing people to see that they can actually reach their dreams. Like, what advice would you have for somebody who has a similar idea where it's like, well, shoot, I'm gonna do this publicist thing, and then you kind of just segue that into more and more business, and look, it's been 10 years. Like, what would you say to somebody who's like standing on the precipice of making that decision?
For going into publicity?
Let's just keep it general, like in terms of just start going into business for themselves.
Yeah, but if you have a job, stay in your job until you have a good 18-month plan and revenue. You know, as long as you can stay in a job and do the thing you want to do, you can be as committed to your job and the thing as you want to be. But it's really, really, really hard to start a job, start out as an entrepreneur if you don't have significant savings you can fall back on. And, you know, for a lot of people, that's not really that possible with the pandemic.
Right.
But make sure that you have a clear revenue target and you have an achievable way to reach that revenue target before you leave your job and commit to something full time, because you're going to have ups and downs. You're going to have client churn. You're going to just have things not work out. And so you don't want to be worried about, how am I going to make this month's rent or mortgage payment? How am I going to pay for my kids' school this month while you're also doing the business? Because you're in charge of payroll. If you have employees, you're in charge of the rent on your office space. You're in charge of taxes and insurance. And, you know, there's a litany of things that you are responsible for exclusively as the CEO, you know, business registration, et cetera. So you have to do all of those things and the thing that you're doing and manage the clients. So the biggest piece of advice is figure out how you're going to get paid for 6 months to 12 months to 18 months. Have that secured. You know, you may not have it in the bank, but know that you have, let's say, 2 clients that are going to pay you more than you need to live off of before you say, I'm going to make the jump completely. Right. Because sure, you can go back to your old job, but if you really want to do this seriously, you want to be able to have enough momentum behind you that you can like reach escape velocity. And that's just really hard to do if you're like going from client to client and, you know, having to deal with a lot of these fluctuations. So to the maximum extent possible, plan it before you do it. That's not what I did. You know, I'm not going to say that's what worked for me. You know, I think that if I had been in a position to do that, I would be in a very different position now. But all my learnings have come from the twists and turns along the way. But you know, if you want to be successful, which is not guaranteed, I would say that that's the number one thing, is just have a financial plan for how to do this.
That's awesome. So you've been doing Moonshot PR for 10 years now. Like, do you have plans to expand into an agency? Do you want to start a startup? Like, do you want to go back to India? Like, what does the next 5 years look like for you?
Well, I want to get this COVID vaccine as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I want to go home and see my parents. I haven't seen them since March of 2020. So, you know, that's the first thing. I want to go back to Seattle and see my family and see my grandmother. You know, I'm really at an interesting transition point now, because I know my skill set. My skill set is valuable. My work speaks for itself. And there's only one of me. So I could go the agency route and grow a team, or I could be more of an advisor and, you know, a long-term partner. And, you know, it may be a hybrid of both, because on the one hand, getting to help early stage companies like do the various things is really exciting. And right now I have a lot of inbound interest, more interest than I can handle. You know, the challenge though is that I don't necessarily like creating jobs for people is really important, and helping people grow in their skills is something that I'm very, I'm passionate about that. And then also, I'm not sure I want to be responsible for a payroll and hiring constantly and all of those things. So, yeah, I'm really looking more at how can I share my knowledge in a form that doesn't need me on a one-to-one basis. So publishing materials, publishing some trainings, so that people can get the knowledge that I have, purchase it when I'm asleep. That's quite appealing to me. In terms of starting a startup, maybe someday. If there's a problem that I really care deeply about solving, and also people that I want to, like an industry that I want to be a part of, and customers I want to have relationships with, that's when it would be interesting to start a startup. But right now, there's not a problem that I know and understand, and a customer group that I know better than publicists and media professionals that I would do on a, make a 5 to 7 to 10 year commitment on a startup.
Right. Well, I appreciate you being on, Chikodi. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm pretty sure we could have gone for another 30 minutes or another hour. I really appreciate you being on. Like, I just love the meritocracy of that's the way I'm interpreting your craft. And it sounds like, you're at the top. So that's awesome.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. It's just got to learn how to be better every day. I appreciate that.
Yes, sir. Well, signing off. I'm just going to turn off the recording, but that was fun, man.